Half a day students, I am Governor Lou Leon Guerrero. You all have been through a year of big changes. We've had to adapt and make big changes to keep our families and our island safe. But with change comes opportunity and a chance to try new things like PBS University. While Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio and I will continue to do our part to keep our island safe, you students have a part to play as well. Your part is to keep learning and to keep up with your lessons. That's why I am happy to see you here ready to learn with PBS University. PBS University is a way to bring a continuous educational curriculum to you while you stay safe at home during this time. To help you keep up with your studies, we asked our friends at PBS Guam and the Guam Department of Education to put together this episode. Thank you for doing your part and have a great lesson.
Humanities Guåhan, an independent nonprofit organization affiliated with the National Endowment for the Humanities, is dedicated to promoting public humanities programming for the people of Guam and providing foundational support and educational resources for our island community. For more information about Humanities Guåhan, visit www.humanitiesguahan.org. The following webinar series is part of a project presented by Humanities Guåhan entitled Unincorporated, Voting, Voices, and Visions Para Guåhan. This project explores Chamorro stories, experiences, and perspectives on civic engagement in relation to voting rights, democracy, political status, and Chamorro self-determination. Unincorporated consisted of the 5-part webinar series that took place from January through May 2021 and covered topics on the origins of Chamorro self-determination, the work of the Commission on Decolonization, the relationship between art and decolonization, and the role of the U.S. legal system as it relates to Guam's political status. The project culminated with the launch of an online and printed magazine distributed throughout the community, which consists of essays, creative reflections, and artwork exploring issues around Guåhan's political status and decolonization through the perspectives and historical and political experiences of the Chamorro people of Guåhan.
Half a day and welcome. I'm Kimberlee of Humanities Guåhan, and we thank you for joining us this afternoon as we launch Unincorporated, Voting, Voices, and Visions Para Guåhan, a 5-part webinar series and digital magazine exploring Chamorro stories, experiences, and perspectives in relation to voting rights, democracy, decolonization, self-determination, and Guam's political status. Humanities Guåhan received a grant of more than $40,000 from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in partnership with the Federation of State Humanities Councils to produce this program as part of a nationwide initiative, Why It Matters, Civic and Electoral Participation. We see ourselves as the convener, connector, and catalyst for this program as we explore why civic engagement matters through an exploration of the political history of Guam and the histories, experiences, and diverse perspectives of the island's indigenous people. Humanities Guåhan is humbled and honored by the opportunity to bring this important project to our island community. Today, we bring you the inaugural webinar in our series, Ti Måmakpo, Chamorro Self-Determination, featuring celebrated historian and scholar Dr. Robert Underwood, in conversation with community advocate and poet Selina Onedera-Salas. I'll now introduce Selina, who will in turn introduce Dr. Underwood. I've been privileged to know Selina for the past 15 years as a previous Humanities Guåhan board member, our current Grant Review Committee chairwoman, as a colleague and a friend. Selina is a legislative policy analyst and community advocate, currently working with the office of Senator Clinton Rigel. She's actively involved in community nonprofit organizations that seek to protect, perpetuate and promote the preservation of CHamoru cultural values. Selina earned a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Texas at San Antonio and immediately returned home to continue her career in public service. Selina also chaired the Literary Arts Committee for the 2016 Festival of Pacific Arts held in Guåhan. Thank you so much, Selina, for your partnership in presenting Unincorporated, and a sincere thank you to Dr. Underwood for giving the inaugural project presentation. Sius Masi. Selina?
Hafaday Zansizu Usmaasi Kim. Hafaday to our participants and panelists for today's webinar. It is my honor to be facilitating this webinar with Dr. Underwood. Before I begin, I do want to share a little bit about our thoughts of the title, Ti Måmakpo. And Dr. Underwood and I and the group decided that this would be an appropriate title for the presentation in the sense that CHamoru self-determination is a plight that has been long fought for, and many people have gone far and wide to share our story of struggle with the rest of the world. And even despite the recent decision by the Supreme Court and the Davis case, we feel that this has not ended. We are not finished. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the title for today's webinar. Some housekeeping rules to get this part out of the way. There is, for those of you who are participating through the Zoom call, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen for you to present your questions. Throughout the presentation, Dr. Underwood we've broken this down into segments, and so after each segment, we will have the opportunity to present questions for him to answer for the group. And I'd also like to ask that you please keep your questions related to the presentation section. So now for the fun part. It is my distinct honor and privilege to present our speaker for today's conversation, the Honorable Dr. Robert Underwood. He is an historian and scholar who has served the people of Guam in many capacities as an educator, a writer, a featured columnist, a respected representative of Guam who served as our delegate for 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, and more recently, he served as president of the University of Guam until he retired in 2018. Dr. Underwood has also spent much of his personal life and time in pursuit of CHamoru self-determination. For decades, he has been directly involved with grassroots movements in the quest for CHamoru self-determination, and his work has inspired generations to continue the discussion and the effort for our people to achieve decolonization. I am pleased to have this time and conversation with Dr. Robert Underwood. Siduus maasi para itempo mupago na haani senyot itareha mupago.
Okay, thank you very much, Sidus Masi Selina. Buenas tardes todos hamzu. I appreciate this opportunity presented by Guåhan Humanities. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that I was on the original Humanities board, as was Narissa, who's also, I noticed, on the call. As some of you know, maybe not all of you know, I'm in an undisclosed location because I'm under quarantine. I just got back on island on Wednesday. So this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about CHamoru self-determination, provide some background, some historical background, and how it was originally conceptualized, historically conceptualized, as we call it now, in the 1970s, and then subsequent to various political developments, the government of Guam has defined it by statute, and basically we're guided by that. And it's also its connection to basically US law and its connection to United Nations conventions or United Nations principles, which is also an important feature of this. And then lastly, to talk about the challenge of the exercise of Chamorro self-determination and its future and how I think it should proceed. And also to clarify in that process a distinction between incremental political progress, which is highly celebrated, and the other part, which is more fundamental, which is actual self-determination or making a case for political status change. Next slide. So here we have the, next slide, there. Now we have the Taotao Tåno. So very good looking people connected to the ocean. And as you can see, they're mostly naked. But the issue here is that we have to kind of understand where this comes from, where this issue comes from. And it of course, it doesn't intellectually come from them, but it actually comes from their experience. And so for some 3,500 years, there have been people living in the Marianas Islands. There's some conversation as to whether a place in Saipan, Unay, Baput, or whether Letegjan, Retidian was the first settled in the Marianas, but it's certainly 3,500 to maybe 4,000 years ago. Next slide. And so in this next slide, we see the Chamorro people, actually Taotao Tåno people. They weren't really called Chamorros until the 19th century in a popular way. And these people, this is reflective of the caste structure and in a highly idealized form. Of course, everybody is healthy and well constructed. So that's what we like to think of as the origins of the Taotao Tåno. Next slide. So the question here is, you have the Taotao Tåno, which are the ancient Chamorros, the progenitors of the Chamorro people today. Then you have the Spanish conquest, and then you have the emergence of the what we commonly call now the Chamorro people, who are actually, successors to the Taotao Tåno. And then the colonial rule actually sort of acknowledged the good thing about colonial rule is it told you who was being ruled and who was ruler, and how that kind of interrupted the process. And it wasn't self-determination was interrupted or taken away. Actually, sovereignty was taken away. Not a nation state, not a nation as we normally think of it, but the idea that the people who lived here, the Taotao Tåno, had sovereignty over their lives. That was taken away. That's what the essence of conquest meant, that there was a new set of authority. And the next slide, please. And the right of conquest, of course, was exercised initially by Spain. It was determined by Legazpi visit, who in the 1560s, who claimed the Marianas and Guam for Spain and exercised its authority just by fiat, by self-proclamation. And it was actually exercised and came to fruition as a result of the missionary Padre Diego de Salvatores. And it's important to note that the conquest was then consummated by the presence of the missionary. It wasn't, sometimes people present these issues as if there was some kind of cultural misunderstanding and everything was going along until they had some kind of cultural misunderstanding, and then all hell broke loose, and that's what caused the problem. Actually, the source of this problem is the idea that there's a right of conquest. That's the source of the issue. So, of course, the motivation of the missionary, Salvatores, was the conversion the people, and the CHamoru people, the Taotao Tåno, and that was seen as legitimate by their own guidelines. But of course, that was illegitimate and not really fully recognized by the Taotao Tåno until they started noticing the exercise of authority, the depopulation because of the onset of diseases, and of course the actual battles that were fought between the Spaniards and the Taotao Tåno, the CHamoru people. Next slide. So the CHamoru people then emerged out of this, what we commonly called originally after the period of depopulation into the 18th century, the 1700s. Sometimes the people were called Marianos because they were from the Mariana Islands, but most often just called basically Indios or natives. And eventually in the 1800s, as a result of a census conducted and the fact that the native inhabitants, the Indios, were relieved of tax obligations. So even mestizos, so-called mestizos, wanted to be Indios, and that became sort of the birth of the CHamoru people. So still going back, and you can see the emergence of that. I think we're talking about a time period that was rich in history. You see a woman there making, using a metate from Mesoamerica, from Mexico, and making corn. You see that they're now smoking, which of course they didn't used to do. And you can also see that they're probably going bare-breasted, around certainly around the home into the 1800s, and then after that they didn't go bare-breasted. I don't think they went bare-breasted in town, but that was the emergence of this group of people that had a kind of an identity of who they were, that they were the Indios, they were the natives of the people of the Marianas, even though there was a lot of mixture between Spaniards and Filipinos. They still saw themselves as the native inheritors of what was the Marianas Islands. Next slide. So the Treaty of Paris in 1898, as a result of the Spanish-American War, then essentially transferred this right of conquest to the United States. So the right of conquest in this is really important to understand, because sometimes we fail to appreciate that the right of conquest meant certain obligations, but it also meant a certain responsibility and a certain acknowledgement that you had taken away something from people. This was not a treaty arrangement. This was not a treaty arrangement with the local people. This was not an agreement. The local people didn't petition for this. They didn't ask to be part of the American Empire. They didn't ask to be part of the Spanish Empire, but simply an exercise of the right of conquest. And the Treaty of Paris and basically transferred that original right of conquest, which Spain had, over to the United States in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. And certain things came out of that act, which have affected the political and social and cultural lives of the island of Guam, indeed the whole Marianas till today. The Treaty of Paris acknowledged that there were native inhabitants' civil and political rights had to be dealt with by the US government. So that was the first time that there was acknowledgement that there were these people and something had to be done with them. And then they had civil and political rights. And so there was a responsibility inherent in it. You just didn't say, I'm taking over and I don't have to listen to anything. I have to do something about the native inhabitants' civil and political rights. And so this, of course, the Philippines and Puerto Rico came to the United States under the same treaty. But unlike the Philippines and Puerto Rico, there were active movements for autonomy and independence in the case of the Philippines. So the Philippines suffered the kind of double whammy of not only being originally conquered by the US, but in terms of declaring their own independence, they were then subsequently conquered by the United States and then handed over. Their sovereignty was handed over. What to do with these new territories is actually the basis for the title of this series. That is through a series of insular cases held by the Supreme Court, Downs versus Bidwell, you had the creation of a category called unincorporated territory. No such distinction exists in statute, and no such distinction exists in the Constitution of the United States. It existed in the framing of this by the Supreme Court. The same Supreme Court, always and constitutional scholars know this, the same Supreme Court that ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that you could have separate but equal. So in a way, you have separate kinds of territories through this, whereas before, all the territories that were acquired by the US through the Louisiana Purchase, through the cession, through conquest in the Mexican War, through even the acceptance of the state of Hawaii and the purchase of Alaska, those territories were presumed to be on a track to statehood. So they had to create, because these were new territories. Oh my gosh, Puerto Ricans, who are they? Filipinos, lots of Filipinos, who are they? And then of course the native inhabitants of Guam. So there was a lot of racial characterizations that these people were not yet ready to even be considered a full territory or any path to statehood, because their traditions and were so radically different than the Anglo-Saxon basis for American rule of law and American culture and American civilization. So that meant that these people were not going to be incorporated. They were they were owned by the United States, but they were not part of the United States. That's the meaning of unincorporated. And so that was done through a series of court decisions, mostly involving customs duties about things that were being brought in from Puerto Rico. That was the origin of it. And so through that, it meant that these people were not US citizens. So they weren't citizens. They weren't part of the United States. They were owned by the United States. They were, in the words of the insular cases, foreign in a domestic sense. That's the whole genesis of where we stand today. So in order to continue to manage affairs, then the naval government was created through presidential executive order, and the President McKinley gave the governance of the island of Guam over to the US Navy, and there it stayed until the US Congress saw fit to pass a law in 1950 to create the Organic Act of Guam. About a few months before the Organic Act of Guam, President Truman did exercise his executive authority to transfer the management of Guam away from the Department of the Navy and turned it over to the Department of Interior, and then in full anticipation of the creation of the Organic Act. And so the next slide, they're not part of the creation. They're not part of the management. They're not part of the request. They're not part of the action. They're simply being transferred from one country to another in terms of the Treaty of Paris. And this state
These webinars can be accessed on Humanities Guåhan's Facebook page. To view the online magazine associated with Unincorporated Voting, Voices, and Visions Para Guåhan, visit humanitiesguåhan.org/unincorporated.
Hafa students, I'm Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio. For more than a year now, you all have continued to wash your hands and watch your distance from others, and you've done a really great job wearing your masks. We know your parents and guardians have helped you to make these changes to keep yourself and your community safe. As Governor Leon Guerrero said, we are happy you are here. We want you to continue to learn and sharpen your skills with the help of PBS University. This program is the result of a collaborative effort. We couldn't do it alone. I'd like to thank the teachers and support staff of the Guam Department of Education and PBS Guam for their work and their commitment to our students. I'd also like to thank you students for participating at home. To your parents, I'd like to thank you for taking an active role in your child's education. We are all eager to return to a time when all of us can share and study together in person. Until then, we hope you learned something new from this PBS University instruction.